Welcome to the 2D Crime Files channel, telling stories of everyday life, where real tragedies make us both shiver and laugh lightly when we hear some simple comments to relieve tension. Imagine this scene. In the middle of a crowded courtroom, the camera lights flashing continuously, the prosecutor stands up, presses the button to play the recording. And then, Scott Peterson's voice rings out, gentle and emotional. "I'm in Paris. I miss you." The audience falls silent, then stirs. People turn to look at each other, eyes wide open. Only, ladies and gentlemen, at that time Scott was not in the splendid Paris. He was standing, right in the prayer service for his missing pregnant wife, Laci Peterson. That was the climax that changed everything. From a mysterious disappearance, the story suddenly revealed a shocking truth. The exemplary husband was having an affair and deceiving not only his wife, family, but also the public. And it was this secret love affair, the affair that changed everything, that became the turning point that made the public and the jury no longer see Scott as an innocent husband, but as a dangerous traitor. The question is secret love enough to turn a man into a wife killer, or is it just a series of emotional lies that accidentally pushed him into public hell? In today's true crime series, we will go from the Scott, Amber Frey affair to the shocking recordings, the role of the media, and how an affair changed the whole case. Trust me, you will see that this is no different from a crime drama, where bad boys, third parties, and tragic deaths blend into a scenario that is both scary and full of irony. Life is full of paradoxes. You can live in a peaceful house, hang sparkling Christmas lights, prepare to welcome a little angel, but at the same time step out and sow sweet words with another woman, as if you were a free bachelor. And that is how Scott Peterson, the man once praised as someone else's husband, began an affair with Amber Frey, a love affair that the whole of America later called by a sour name. The affair that changed everything. In November 2002, just over a month before Laci went missing, Scott met Amber through a mutual friend. Amber Frey was then a 27-year-old single mother, living in Fresno, not far from Modesto. She worked as a massage therapist, had long blonde hair, a gentle smile, and hopeful eyes. After the emotional trauma, Amber hoped to find a kind man to rely on and raise her young child. And then Scott appeared like a dream prince. From the very first moment, Scott put on the perfect mask. He introduced himself as single, never married, and running a fertilizer import-export company, which sounds a bit funny, but creates the appearance of a successful businessman. With his tall appearance, elegant demeanor, and confident voice, Scott quickly made Amber believe that she had met the right person. At this point, we can add a popular saying: "It is true that bad boys always have the talent to promote themselves, while good husbands only know how to go to the market to buy vegetables." In the early days of dating, Scott appeared sweet and thoughtful. He took Amber out to dinner, gave her flowers, and talked passionately about the future. Amber felt a rare connection, to the point that she confided to her friends that maybe this was the man she would be with. But few expected that just a few weeks later, she would become a key witness in a murder case that shocked America. When talking about Scott, Amber remembers that he knew how to make an impression. He often sent romantic texts, called unexpectedly just to say, "I miss you," and always seemed to listen and care. That struck a chord with Amber, a woman who had been disappointed in love, now longing for a strong shoulder. But parallel to those sweet words, in Modesto, Laci Peterson, Scott's legal wife, was 8 months pregnant, busy preparing for Christmas, hanging lights on the porch, cooking, and waiting for the day their son Connor was born. The contrast was chilling. A gentle wife, an unborn child, and a two-faced husband living like a TV drama. Scott hid this relationship skillfully. He arranged his time to maintain the role of model husband in Modesto while playing the role of single businessman with Amber. The climax of the lie was in early December 2002. Scott whispered to Amber, "I have to tell you something. This will be the first Christmas I have to spend alone because my wife has passed away." Yes, you heard correctly. When Laci was still alive, still pregnant, Scott made up the story that he was a widower. Hearing this, many people probably wanted to stand up and bang the table. "Hey, this guy." That lie became the fuel, because a few weeks later, when Laci really went missing, the public would remember and find it creepy. It seemed that Scott had prophesied his wife's death. Amber, at that time, of course, believed it. She also comforted Scott, saying that she understood his loneliness, that she would accompany. During Christmas, when the whole of America gathered around her family, Amber believed that she was being a spiritual support for a widower. Meanwhile, the reality was cruel. Laci Peterson disappeared on December 24th, and the whole country was searching for her in panic. Here, let's pause for a moment to see the irony. If Scott hadn't had an affair, if he hadn't made up the story of his widower, perhaps public opinion would have viewed him differently. But because of Amber, because of those romantic lies, Scott turned himself into a traitor in the eyes of millions of people. And when the prosecutor brought Amber to court, it was a fatal blow. But in the beginning, when no one knew, Amber was still immersed in vague happiness. She recounted that in the early days of dating, Scott even called to sing her a lullaby before going to sleep. Sounds sweet, doesn't it? But it turned out that it was just an act in the two-faced movie that he wrote and performed himself. Then came the fateful day of December 24th. While all of Modesto was in an uproar over Laci's disappearance, Scott continued to contact Amber. He called, saying he was in Europe on business, specifically Paris. He described fireworks and loud music. In reality, he was standing in the middle of a vigil for his missing wife. That scene, when revealed in court, outraged the entire United States. People saw Scott not only as a suspect in the case, but also as a shameless romantic deceiver. In many interviews later, Amber tearfully said that she felt used, turned into a pawn. And perhaps it was that feeling that prompted her to cooperate fully with the police, providing all the recordings of her calls with Scott. These recordings became a heavy weapon in the hands of the prosecutor because they exposed blatant lies. In it, Scott not only lied about his whereabouts, but also showed indifference to the disappearance. There was no panic, no pain, just sweet words for his lover. When the public heard it, they unanimously concluded, this person is guilty. And so, the secret affair from being a personal secret turned into a turning point that determined his fate. If it weren't for Amber, Scott would probably just be a suspect without evidence. But with Amber, with the recordings, the image of Scott as a cold... That's why it is said that sometimes betrayal in love not only destroys a family, but also exposes a murder case. At the end of Chapter 1, we can clearly see the affair between Scott Peterson and Amber Frey was not simply an affair, but was the fuse, the spark, the catalyst that turned the whole case from mystery to anger, from suspicion to conviction. It was the affair that changed everything. And from here, the story will expand. How the police exploited this relationship, how the media turned it into a national show, and how Amber, from an innocent woman, became a fateful witness. When news of Laci Peterson's disappearance swept across the country, Amber Frey was still reeling from a mix of emotions. At first, she couldn't believe it. The man she'd been dating, whom she thought was a single businessman, was married, and worse, that his wife, who was 8 months pregnant, had mysteriously disappeared. Amber described the news as feeling like someone had dumped a bucket of cold water on her head, shaking her whole body with shock. But the problem was that it wasn't just shock, it was also guilt. Oh my God, I'm in love with a man whose entire country is hunting for his missing wife. For the first few days, Amber was devastated. But then, one decision changed everything. She contacted the police. Without hiding anything, without beating around the bush, Amber revealed the entire relationship, providing text messages, appointments, and most importantly, agreeing to record her calls with Scott under police surveillance. This was the turning point that the press later called the fatal blow to Scott Peterson. Imagine the police at that time. They were struggling to find physical evidence, searching for blood and murder weapons, when suddenly a lover walked in, showing a treasure of a series of phone calls. A detective recalled that when Amber agreed to cooperate, the whole conference room applauded because they knew that voluntary lies from Scott's mouth would be more valuable than fingerprints. So, starting from the end of December 2002 and throughout January 2003, The police quietly listened to every call between Scott and Amber. Each call was fully recorded, and in it, Scott exposed everything: lies, indifference, and even sweet love drama, while the whole country was looking for a wife for him. One of the most haunting moments was on New Year's Eve. While Laci's family and hundreds of Modesto residents lit candles and prayed, Scott called Amber and said in a romantic tone, "I'm in Paris, honey. The fireworks are beautiful." Can you imagine the brazenness? A man who lost his wife, who should have been running around, stood at a prayer service and created a fake Paris to seduce his lover. When this recording was released, the American public went crazy. The press ran headlines: "Scott lied in Paris while attending a prayer service for his wife." People were outraged. Television networks played it continuously. Talk shows analyzed every word, and audiences shook their heads. This guy is definitely guilty. In fact, legally, the recordings did not prove that Scott killed his wife. But psychologically, the public had already convicted him. This is the unique point of this case. The direct evidence was scarce, but the emotional evidence was overwhelming. And in the media age, emotions are often stronger than reason. Amber, in the role of the betrayed lover, gradually became an unwilling celebrity. The press followed her, interviewed her, took pictures, and even scrutinized the way she tied her hair. But Amber was steadfast. She cooperated with the police, did not hide anything, and was ready to go to court. It was this transparency that made the public, instead of blaming the third person, sympathize. People considered Amber the victim of a two-faced man. It was only natural. Ask a normal woman, when hearing a man say his wife had passed away and he was lonely, who wouldn't be moved? The fault was not Amber's, but Scott's, the smooth fabricator. The police continued to take full advantage. They encouraged Amber to keep in touch regularly, so that Scott could reveal himself. And indeed, the more Scott talked, the more he made mistakes. In one call, he described in detail his virtual trip to Europe. In another, he promised to come to Amber soon. All of this further accentuated the image of a cold-blooded man who considered his wife's death a small matter. A detective later said, "We don't need Scott to confess. As long as he continues to lie, the public will convict him." And they were right. Meanwhile, Laci's family painfully watched. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, burst into tears when she heard the recording. She said, "I can't believe that when the whole community was looking for my daughter, she was calling to flirt with her lover." That pain made the public even more indignant. The media seemed to add fuel to the fire. Newspapers published articles every day. Talk shows competed to analyze the affair. Americans discussed Amber Scott, Laci like they were discussing a TV series. One newspaper even compared, if Hollywood wrote a script, they wouldn't have come up with it. Here, let me add a joke. It's true that real life is sometimes more dramatic than Netflix originals. The recordings were quickly released to the public and became a media blockbuster. Every time a news segment was released, television ratings skyrocketed. People sat glued to the tape, eagerly listening to each "I miss you, baby," then shaking their heads in dismay. That indignation gradually turned into enormous pressure on the jury later, because they were not only listening to evidence in the courtroom, but also living in a society that already considered Scott a murderer. As for the police, they were recording while quietly reinforcing other details, checking Scott's location, following the doc receipts, and especially comparing the times of the calls that called to his journey. Each piece gradually fit together. Although there was no murder weapon, no blood, the image of a cheating, lying husband, and the coincidence of a location where the body was dumped were enough to give the prosecutor confidence to enter court. At the end of January 2003, Amber decided to go public before the press. At a press conference, she appeared, her voice trembling but determined, declaring, "I was deceived by Scott Peterson. I thought he was single, but it turns out he wasn't. I will cooperate fully with the police to find justice for Laci." The image of Amber shedding tears, holding her young daughter in front of the camera, immediately created a strong effect. The public turned from suspicion to sympathy and considered her a living proof of Scott's betrayal. From here, The affair was no longer just a secret love story, but became social evidence, evidence of the people's hearts. And once the people's hearts had condemned her, Scott's path was only downhill. By the end of Chapter 2, we see clearly the fateful phone calls, the Paris lies, the sweet but cold recordings have turned Scott Peterson from a weak suspect into a national villain. And it was Amber Frey's courageous cooperation that changed the whole situation. Without these phone calls, the case would not have ended like this. But with them, Scott has driven himself into a... If you think the police and the courts are the only places where Scott Peterson is being tried, you are very wrong. As soon as the affair was exposed, the whole of America turned into a giant courtroom, where everyone from housewives, taxi drivers to TV psychologists played the role of jurors. Without waiting for the day of the prosecution's presentation, Scott was stared at by millions of eyes and commented on by millions of mouths. The American media, which is famous for smelling drama like a bloodhound, immediately seized on this affair and turned it into the main content of newspapers, TV, radio, and talk shows. From CNN, Fox News, to morning shows like Good Morning America, everyone reserved their golden slots to talk about the cheating husband. Every time you turn on the TV, you will see a photo of Laci with a big belly smiling next to a photo of Scott smiling awkwardly below the big words, "The affair that changed everything." People were talking about it like they were watching a series of movies. In the morning, when they went to work, they asked each other, "Have you heard the recording of yesterday's episode?" In the afternoon, when they came back to the supermarket, they heard housewives gossiping. "That guy definitely killed his wife. He cheated on her and even made up Paris." The media at this time was like a movie director, editing, adding tense background music, repeating the images of Laci and Amber to depict the contrast. On one side was the virtuous pregnant wife, on the other side was the innocent blonde lover, and in the middle was the cheating husband. The American public already loved stories of holiness versus betrayal. Now, with the addition of the body floating in the bay, the fever reached its peak. Media companies also competed to interview neighbors, friends, and former teachers. Anyone who had met Scott or Laci was invited to appear on TV to tell their story. Even in 7th grade, Scott cheated in a baseball game became hot news. Some people even said, "He was born to be a liar. He was like that since he was a child." It makes you laugh, but it shows that the media has shaped Scott as a professional scoundrel. In that context, the police and prosecutors benefited a lot. They understood that even though the physical evidence was not strong, public opinion had put Scott in a difficult position. The prosecutor even smiled. "We have millions of assistant prosecutors out there, the public." But on the contrary, the defense attorneys were grim. They lamented that how could Scott get a fair trial when the whole country considered him a criminal? Once, a lawyer compared, "This is like throwing a fish into a pan of boiling oil and telling it to calm down." And we have to admit, he was right. Imagine a juror who reads the newspaper during the day and turns on the TV at night to listen to talk shows analyzing Scott is definitely guilty. Then when they sit in court, will they still be objective? That is why the media, in this case, is called the second court, the court of public opinion. Scott now became public enemy number one. Polls showed that more than 80% of Americans believed he was guilty before the official trial took place. That means he lost right from the start. Meanwhile, Amber Frey suddenly became an unwilling hero. From an unknown single mother, Amber stepped up to the press conference podium, held the microphone, and frankly said that she was deceived, that she would help find justice for Laci. That image appeared everywhere, making the public sympathize. Amber was praised as a brave victim who dared to stand up and expose the traitor. The press also called her the other woman who spoke the truth. A TV station even invited Amber to sign a contract to write a book and make a documentary. And, later on, her book really sold like hotcakes. But now, in 2003, Amber's appearance added fuel to the fire. The public now pitted not only Laci, but also Amber, Scott's double victim. One side was the missing wife, the other side was the deceived lover. So in the eyes of everyone, Scott was no longer a suspect, but a monster. He had both killed his wife and deceived his lover. Public opinion was so indignant that many people hung banners in front of the court. Execute Scott immediately. Others wrote slogans such as Justice for Laci and Connor. Some even set up dolls with pregnant bellies, holding pictures of Scott and the words murderer. The atmosphere was no different from a protest. Meanwhile, evening talk shows were competing to dissect. This lawyer analyzed, that psychologist commented, the forensic expert gave a presentation, and the audience sat and watched as if watching a game show. Someone joked. In fact, Scott Peterson was more famous than the Hollywood star at that time, except that he was famous for being a bad husband. It was tragic, but also realistic. The media pressure was so strong that the police had to publicly remind the public, please don't take matters into your own hands. Let justice take its course. But the more they talked, the more outraged they became. Some even went to Scott's parents' house to curse. The Peterson family was implicated, living in shame. Here, we can insert a bitter joke. When your brother commits a crime, the whole family suffers. It's true that one person does it, the whole village suffers. The recordings between Scott and Amber became a blockbuster ting. Whichever station rebroadcasts it, the audience would sit and listen with fascination as if listening to a hit album. Some people even copied down each sentence and discussed it on forums. This was the first time in history that a criminal case had been emotionally live-streamed nationwide. This made the Laci Peterson case no longer a normal case, but a cultural phenomenon. And it was the media that turned the affair into the central story, pushing the forensic details and pieces of scientific evidence to the sidelines. For the public, the evidence was enough. The adulterer, the Paris lie, the missing wife, the body floating in the bay, that was enough to convict them in their hearts. Thus, Chapter 3 ended with a scene not unlike an open-air trial. The press, the media, talk shows, the public, all speaking with one voice of accusation. And in the midst of that storm, Scott Peterson gradually sank with no way out. From here, the question arises, in the official trial, will the prosecutor take advantage or will the media power be exhausted? Or can the defense attorney turn the tables by proving that emotion? When Scott Peterson's trial officially began, America held its breath. The press, television, and radio stations all converged on Redwood City, where the courtroom was packed and the yard was packed with reporters, banners, and even vendors selling popcorn and T-shirts with Laci's image. Yes, this case was not just a family tragedy, but had become a national event. From the very first day, the prosecutor opened with a strong indictment. Scott Peterson betrayed his wife, betrayed his family, betrayed society. To free himself, he killed his wife and unborn son. That statement was like a hammer blow, shaking the entire courtroom. The prosecutor presented their plan of indictment. They would prove that Scott had committed adultery, lied, and taken his wife out of his life to be free to Amber Frey. Their main piece was the affair, the secret love affair that the whole world knew about. And to add to the drama, they announced that they would call Amber as a witness. On the other side, the defense attorney emphasized a single sentence. Adultery is not synonymous with murder. They reminded the jury that there was no blood, no weapon, no eyewitnesses. They tried to separate the crime of bad husband from the crime of murder. But it was easier said than done, because the whole of America had long since taken on the role of judge. The trial continued with a series of witnesses called. Neighbors testified that they had seen Laci walking her dog on the morning of December 24th, but no one was sure of the time. Someone said they saw a woman who looked like Laci afterward, but their testimony was vague. The defense attorney quickly latched onto this detail to sow doubt. Maybe Laci was alive after Scott left the house. But the prosecutor immediately retorted, if she was alive, why did her body wash up right where Scott said she went fishing? The argument sounded reasonable, making the jury nod. Then the most shocking moment came. Amber Frey entered the courtroom. The entire courtroom held its breath. The media raised their cameras and clicked continuously, as if welcoming a movie star. Amber dressed simply, her face tense, but her eyes determined. When asked, she recounted in detail her relationship with Scott, how they met, the lies, especially the story of his wife died. This is the first Christmas he spent alone. The entire courtroom fell silent. Only the sound of the reporter tapping on the keyboard could be heard. The climax was when the prosecutor played the recording. Scott whispered, "I'm in Paris. I miss you," while in fact he was standing in the middle of a prayer service for Laci. Hearing that, some people in the room burst into tears, others shouted angrily. Amber shed tears as she said she felt betrayed, turned into a tool. That image was unforgettable to the jury. It was true that, legally, the whispers did not prove murder. But emotionally, they convicted Scott on the spot. The prosecution skillfully pieced it all together. The coincidence of where the body was dumped, the emotional deception, the preparation for escape, hair dye, fake ID cash, the cold attitude when his wife went missing. Every little detail came together to form the big picture, a cold-blooded killer. The defense tried to fight back. They emphasized that the forensics could not determine the cause of death, that there were no physical traces tying Scott to the death. They argued that the prosecution was relying only on emotions and public opinion. But the jury sat listening, Scott's voice, "I miss you from Paris," still echoing in their heads, and the image of Laci with a pregnant belly smiling gently. Emotions were stronger than logic. Outside the courtroom, the media continued the trial on air. Every night talk show replayed the image of Amber crying, comparing it to Scott's forced smile. The American people considered this trial of the century. Some even stayed up all night to watch it live. Every detail was dissected and discussed like the Super Bowl. The public was almost certain of the verdict before the end of the trial. But in the courtroom, the prosecution did not let up. They called in a forensic expert who confirmed that the body matched the time of disappearance. They called in a detective who described how they had tracked Scott as he prepared to flee. And most importantly, they let Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, speak. Sharon wept, talking about her sweet daughter and unborn grandchild. She looked straight at Scott and asked, "Why did my child have to die? Why did my grandchild never see the light of day?" The courtroom fell silent, and several jurors wiped away tears. It was the moment many believed Scott's fate was sealed. After months of trial, hundreds of hours of deliberation, the jury finally entered the courtroom to deliberate. Outside, the public waited like they were watching a football final. When they returned, it took just 7 days to deliver their verdict. Scott Peterson was guilty of first-degree murder of Laci and second-degree murder of the unborn child Connor. The courtroom exploded. Laci's family hugged and cried, prosecutors clasped hands in joy, and the crowd cheered outside. Scott sat motionless, eyes blank, as if in disbelief. But that wasn't all. A few weeks later, at the sentencing, the jury recommended the death penalty. The court agreed. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The crowd outside applauded, chanting justice for Laci. The headlines read, "The murderer of the treason was sentenced to death." The trial ended, but the echoes lingered. Because it was not just a case, but a lesson in the power of the media, in how an affair can change the entire legal situation. At the end of Chapter 4, we see clearly, it was not only the prosecutor who convicted Scott, but the public, the media, and public opinion that sent him to the gallows. And from here, the story will open up in another direction. Appeals, arguments about fairness, and the question, can a person be tried fairly when the whole world has already judged? As the gavel rang out in the courtroom announcing his death sentence, Scott Peterson sat motionless, staring into the distance, while Laci's family hugged and cried. The 2004 death sentence brought to an end one of the most tumultuous trials in California history, but it did not close the story. In fact, it was just the beginning of a long journey filled with countless appeals, disputes, and unanswered questions. After the trial, Scott was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, home to America's most notorious death row inmates. Within those cold walls, a man who once had everything was now reduced to a prison uniform, a frugal meal, and long days awaiting execution. But in America, death sentences are rarely carried out immediately. The law allows for a series of appeals, and Scott and his team of lawyers took full advantage. They argued that the trial was unfair, the jury was biased by the media, and the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial. For nearly 2 decades, Scott Peterson's name kept popping up in the papers, not because of the main trial, but because of new appeals. Each time there was an appeal, the media rehashed the entire case, dividing American public opinion into 2 camps. One camp firmly believed that Scott was guilty, based on adultery, on his cold demeanor, on the creepy coincidence between where he went fishing and where his body was found. The other, smaller but no less fierce, camp argued that the death sentence was based on emotion, not evidence. No blood, no weapon, no witnesses. This is a media verdict, not a legal verdict, they said. These arguments lasted for years, to the point that Americans called this case the never-ending case. Meanwhile, Laci's family, especially her mother Sharon Rocha, continued their journey to find justice and healing. Sharon wrote a book about the pain of losing her child, gave speeches, and campaigned for the rights of pregnant women. She became a symbol of resilience, but in her heart, the pain never subsided. Every Christmas, when lights were on everywhere, she remembered the day her daughter went missing and remembered her grandchild who had not yet cried out when he was born. That image made the American public even more sympathetic and indignant. Amber Frey, her former lover, also had to learn to live with public opinion. From an unknown woman, she suddenly became the center of national attention. The press followed her every step and every relationship after that. Amber wrote books, appeared on talk shows, but also faced a lot of criticism. If it weren't for her, would Scott have killed his wife? However, most of the public sympathized, considering Amber a victim of lies. She did the right thing, stood up, cooperated, and told the truth. Time passed, but the Scott Peterson story was not over. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence, saying that the jury selection was improper. Although the murder conviction remained, the overturning of the death sentence caused a public outcry once again. Scott's supporters cheered, "Justice has been restored." Opponents were outraged. "Don't let the murderer escape the law." The story was brought up again, prolonging the debate for many more years. During this process, an important detail gradually emerged as a new focal point: Scott Peterson's boat. From the beginning, the prosecution emphasized Scott used a small boat to transport Laci's body to San Francisco Bay and throw it into the water. But the tricky question was that tiny boat strong enough for a man to carry an 8-month pregnant body alone and then dump it into the sea without anyone seeing it? The defense attorney used this detail to counterattack. They argued that the prosecution could not prove that Scott could actually do it. Experts also joined the debate. Some said possible, others said impossible. There were even TV reconstruction experiments. People used models, fake sandbags, to test whether the boat would capsize. And every time the boat was brought up for discussion, public opinion boiled over. Because without the boat, the entire prosecution scenario would be shaky. That is why part 4 of this story is called The Evidence in the Boat. That small boat is not only a piece of evidence, but also a symbol of the entire investigation. Fragile, precarious, easily overturned by the storms of controversy. At the end of part 3, we look back. The Laci Peterson case exposed one of the most heartbreaking tragedies of modern America. A good wife, an unborn child, a cheating husband, a lover who accidentally turned into a witness, a national trial, and a controversial death sentence that has lasted for decades. But the big question remains: will the evidence of the boat be enough to hold the verdict, or will it overturn the entire case in subsequent appeals? And that's where we come in. Back-end index pointing right, don't look away, because in part 4, Laci Peterson investigation, The Evidence in the Boat, true crime documentary, we will dissect every detail through the fateful boat, from scientific experiments, conflicting hypotheses, to how the prosecution and defense turned it into a weapon in the fight for justice. Believe me, if part 3 made you angry because of the deceitful love, part 4 will make you excited like watching a life and death chess match, where even a small boat can decide the fate of a person.